Hey, big idea number 2 is tactics. And you got a lot to say about tactics, don't you?
Absolutely. There are direct and obvious ways people use to influence others. And we will deal with the indirect ones shortly. But these are the direct ways. And after this podcast, you'll understand power and other direct means of influence. A researcher named Kelman, Kelman, came out years ago with 3 processes of social influence which have stood the test of time. One of these is called compliance. And compliance is where you influence somebody because you can force them to do it. So they may be doing what you want them to do, but they haven't bought into it. It's like sometimes when your parents made you do something you didn't want to do. Or, maybe something in the job you don't want to do, but you have to because you don't want to get fired. The second of the 3 processes of social influence is called identification. And this is an idea that will surface a couple of times before we're done with this book. Identification is where you accept influence from somebody because of a relationship you have with them or you want to have with them. So you're trying to please them. It goes both ways. They may do things for you because they like you or they want you to like them or be impressed by them. It's called identification. And the third one is called internalization. And internalization is where the person has taken that attitude as their own. They have been convinced that this is the right way to do things. This is the only one of these 3 that directly is attitude change, although identification can eventually lead to attitude change when you see that somebody is using somebody as a role model.
Yeah, and so power, when you think of the word power, you don't think of it in terms of something that power is used in terms of subtlety.
Right.
But what you're saying is it's more than power in the context of it being subtle. You're talking about power in the context of tactics.
Exactly.
And so talk a little bit about the difference between power and tactics and how those ideas work together.
Well, let me tell you that what tactic you use is going to depend on the type of power you use.
Okay.
So let me talk a little bit about the different types of power. And these also are things that have stood the test of time. French and Raven were the researchers that originally opened this door, and I have added some things to it over my 3 decades plus of teaching persuasion. First of all, I want to talk to you about what power is for a second. People do not understand power. Power is not something that resides in an individual. Power does not reside in the individual. Power resides in the relationship. Everybody that has power over you, you give it to them. You don't like it? Quit. Walk away. Don't ever see him again. Don't ever talk to him again. And everybody in life that you have power over, they're giving that to you. They can quit. They can walk away. So power is what we call an interpersonal trait. It exists in relationships. It is not something that exists in a person. If absolutely nobody went along with the President of the United States, he would have no power. If, nobody did what the parents wanted him to do, they would have no power. You'd find those parents taking their kids to therapy. You never have to give in to anybody else's power. You can always choose to forfeit the ball game. You don't have to give in, even if the threat was death. You don't have to give in. And nobody ever has to give in to your power. So sometimes you're going to need to be a little bit more subtle than using the direct power. So there are several bases of power, and I'd like to share some of them with you right now. And Dr. Jubaville will jump in as he feels the need to.
Sure.
One of the bases of power is reward power. I have power over you if I can give you something you want, like grading a course, or my affections, or something else that you desire to have, and you see me as the source of giving you that reward. So obviously that's obvious, right? People give us rewards. They have power over us. The second type is called coercive power. And that's where I have power over somebody or they have power over me because I can hurt them or they can hurt me. That's force. I'm going to make you do something because I control the job. Do reward and coercive power go together? Sure they do. Sometimes the not giving somebody a reward is a punishment. And sometimes not giving somebody a punishment they deserve is a reward. But they are two separate bases of power and can be used separately. You have to be careful using coercive power because how do you feel when somebody makes you do something? Okay, so when we talked about Kelman's theory earlier with compliance, that basically deals with reward power and coercive power. And neither one of those, I would argue, leads directly to attitude change. Okay, you might actually resist against it. The third type of power is referent power, similar to Kelman's identification earlier. I have power over somebody if they like me or want me to like them, and they have power over me if I want them to like me or I want their best wishes. The fourth of French and Raven's power basis is expert power. I have power over somebody if they think I know what I'm talking about. For example, when I'm teaching persuasion, if people think I know what I'm talking about, I can influence their behavior because of my expertise. But never forget that expertise is in the eye of the beholder. You have to sometimes convince people of your expertise, how you dress, how you manage yourself. You might show degrees you have, experience that you have, and then you're more likely to be able to influence people with expert power. Now, the fifth base of power from French and Raven is called legitimate power. And that is where I have power over you that's sort of verified by society or the law. For example, police officers have legitimate power. The President of the United States has legitimate power. Your college professor has legitimate power to determine your grade. Your boss has legitimate power to direct your activities. So all of these are different bases of power. And not all of them lead to attitude change because remember, we're talking about direct means of social influence. So some of these, well, I'm just doing that because he says to do it. I'm just doing it because he's the boss. I'm doing it because I like him. I'm doing it because he can hurt me. I'm doing it because he can reward me. Those are all ways we influence people. But on the other hand, they may not lead to attitude change. Now, over time, I talked about other types of power, that bases of power that exist. And one is informational power. It's subtly different than expert power. If I know what's going on in the company, people are going to come to me to find out what's going on and to tell me what's going on. And so there are certain people that you will find in your workplace that are what I call informational leaders. They know what's going on. You can go find out what's going on, or you can actually try to set the stage for yourself by leaking information to them. And then they have the informational power. And the final one we're going to talk about today, before we move on to this topic, is the power of access. If I control access to powerful people, if I control whether or not you get there, I've got power. If I control access to things you need, I have power. For example, I have a secretary and runs my operation, and she controls who gets to see me. She controls who phone calls get through. I always thought that one of the most powerful people in the world, in our country anyway, is somebody that doesn't get the credit for it. And that's the chief of staff of the White House. Because the chief of the staff of the White House controls who gets to see the president. And the president has the power. But the chief of staff gets to decide who gets access to that president.
And so the takeaway for the student here is that these different pieces of power and the way it's created through the relationship. And it's important for you to understand and be aware of how that relationship is created, and then be able to persuade based on the relationship that is there.
That's right. And remembering that, your power may lie, and if you're the boss, you may have legitimate power, but it helps if the people respect your expertise. That gives you that base of power, and they want to be liked by you, and so there's your referent power. And certainly always be in the job market, always be respectful to the secretary who controls whether or not you get to see the boss. Be really nice to the people who produce the materials, because if you're nice to them, they'll get your materials on time because they control access as to whether or not you're getting the things you want. Yeah. So when you realize these different bases of power, these are things that will make your life easier. And also, you can use it yourself. When I first became a young college professor right out of graduate school, I came to MTSU. They wanted somebody to control and coordinate the access to all the research labs. And I sat in my very first faculty meeting when nobody raised their hands. But being out of social psychology, I realized that if I said yes, and everybody laughed at me for taking on this job, but I now controlled access to the research labs at MTSU Psychology. And I could trade those favors through a process we'll talk about in a few minutes called reciprocity.
There it is. Big idea number 2, tactics and power.